hand over to Mike Pepler, who's a Green Christian member and who works for the Ashton Awards. And he's going to introduce and facilitate this session. Thank you, Mike.
Great, thank you, Deborah. So welcome to this session on politics and practicalities. So as you probably know, we already have all the technology and knowledge needed to make a transition to a society. We don't really need to wait around for any new innovations, though they are of course welcome if they're appropriate. But we are lacking sufficient pace and tension, and the risks of runaway climate change and ecosystem collapse do not get the attention they deserve in most sectors of society. Now, inevitably, this comes down to politics at a national and international level, but also at a local level, and politics within businesses, churches, and churches and any organisation. So we have here today a really great panel assembled to talk through this with us, and we're going to cover a range of topics, including building trust with MPs, working with councils, bishops, and the difference that protest movements can make. So just to introduce the panel then, we've got Willis, and she's Professor in Practice at Lancaster Environment Centre and an expert lead for Climate Assembly UK. In 2009, founded Green Alliance's Climate Leadership Programme, which is an initiative to support members of the UK Parliament. Her book, Too Hot to Handle, The Democratic Challenge of Climate, published in April 2020. So that's probably well worth a look if you find what she says today interesting. Jenny Cooke is also with us. She's a rail engineer from and her career is focused on innovation for weather resilience and decarbonisation of the rail network. So she sits on the Industrial Advisory Board for the largest rail department in Europe at the University of Birmingham. And she's helped develop sustainability training materials for Network Rail staff. She's also recently started City, a new prayer and support network for business people in Birmingham seeking to bless and protect God's creation through their working lives. This is part of Chaplaincy Plus, a workplace network that helps Birmingham Christians and their businesses to thrive. We've also got Rachel Mander, and she studied philosophy before going to work in Parliament. Now, her environmental activism has brought her to Hope for the Future, where she works to enable faith communities to build effective relationships with MPs around climate change. She's also executive assistant to Dave Bookless, who many of you will have heard, at conservation charity Arosha International, and is of the Young Christian Climate Network. And finally, we're also joined by Geoff Stratford, and he's a retired science teacher who had an abrupt wake-up call of climate change in 2008. We'll hear more about that in a moment. Further investigation alerted him to the power of vested interests seeking to undermine the science on climate change. So he became a self-appointed agitator and launched himself into a range of action involving his church, denomination, city council, but I won't tell you any more about that because it will spoil his story. Right, so bit of a problem with my sound. Apologies for that. I'll carry on, but let me know if that does cause a problem. So just to remind you, this session is being recorded, text chat, so that's just for your information. The format we're going to follow is about 10 minutes per speaker, and then we'll have some time for Q&A after that, and then a little bit of a wrap up at the very end. Everyone other than the speakers will be on mute, so please put your questions into the text chat, and if they're aimed at a panel member, then please say so in your question. And I'd like to ask the panel to keep themselves muted when they're not speaking as well, to keep the background down. And I will remind you if you're running much over your allotted time. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Rebecca to her views on the politics and practicalities. Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Mike, and hi everyone. Greetings from a very rainy Cumbria, characteristically rainy Lake District. A lot of what I'll be saying today is as Geoff said, based on this book, Too Hot to Handle. So if what I say whets your appetite, do have a look at that. All the royalties are going to various climate causes. So I'm going to start with a provocation from a provocative man, James Lovelock, who's an Earth system scientist, now 100 years old. A little while ago, he expressed his deep frustration with our collective inability to tackle climate change. And he said, it may be an issue as serious as war. It may be necessary to put democracy on hold for a while. And I think what James Lovelock articulated in those very stark terms was something that actually I think many of those pushing for climate action feel, that democracy somehow gets in the way of climate action, that experts and maybe even environmental groups should be in the driving seat. And in my work on the work that I've done over the past 20 years on climate strategy, this call for expert-led decisions is something that I have seen constantly. So every day there are new reports and new bits of research saying what needs to be done. And you know, they range from the most obvious and everyday, like the need for a comprehensive shift to renewables, to things which are, you know, speculative and unproven, like sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's no shortage of experts offering solutions. But what I've seen is far less attention paid to the crucial question of how we, as a human society, should debate, agree, and carry out plans to tackle climate change. And I sometimes find this surprising that even environmental groups, even democratically elected governments, have been pretty reluctant to actually reach out beyond their sort of core base and talk to people, have a dialogue about what needs to happen. So the dominant approach by government has been what I've called climate policy by stealth. So focusing on those things like decarbonisation of the power sector, for example, that can be done without people noticing. And the dominant approach by environmental groups, with honourable exceptions, the dominant approach has been to appeal to their core, essentially, to try and appeal to their members and get their members more active, but not think so much about widening their reach. So I think this lack of attention to democracy and outreach is deeply problematic. And my own research actually suggests that we need more democracy, not less, if we're going to solve the climate crisis. 3 reasons why we need more democracy, not less. The first is a very practical one. So as reports from the Committee on Climate Change make clear, we can't get to net zero without people noticing. So the changes ahead, whether that be changes to transport, to land use, to the way we generate electricity, they need people to engage. And people are experts in their own lives. They know how they live in their houses, they know how they want to travel. And so there's a very practical reason why we need to listen to people and involve them in the changes to make sure that they're designed in the ways that work for them. And the second reason is essentially a moral reason. So, you know, scientists can tell us the science, economists can offer their modelling, environmental activists can, you know, offer their passion and point of view, but climate change affects all of us in different ways. And what gives the sort of self-appointed experts the right to say that people shouldn't be involved, that it shouldn't be tackled through democracy? Why should we make the assumption that citizen voters need to be bypassed? And instead, I mean, this is sort of, you know, when you think about it, it's really obvious that we should in fact be assuming that if we give people enough evidence, enough responsibility, enough stake in the process, most people would support action to protect the planet that sustains their life. So there's the second reason is that moral one. And the third, and linked, is the deficiencies that we see in our current democratic system. And I think this is something we're going to come back to in this debate, judging by those introductions to the speakers. There are really problematic power relations in politics, as you'll grasp by looking at any newspaper at the moment. There's very good evidence that incumbent companies and industries have really strong influence over politics. So this matters for climate because we need a really quick transition away from the status quo, and that means changes to the economy. So the companies of the future, by definition, because they're smaller and in some cases don't exist yet, those companies of the future, by definition, never have as loud a voice as the companies whose very reason for existence might be threatened, like the oil and gas majors, for example. So we need to look at how we can tackle this imbalance in the democratic system. So let me shift then to what needs to be changed, what needs to change, and how we could tackle climate change in a democratic way. My first point might sound really obvious, but I think it's absolutely crucial. There's a need to speak out, to have an end to this climate politics by stealth. Politicians need to speak really openly about the significance of climate change, and they need to ask people to play their part. And I think the upsurge of climate emergency declarations that happened particularly last year is, I really hope, the starting point for this more honest politics. So once you're speaking out, what do you say? Well, you know, the critical thing is, and, you know, I have this conversation with politicians, the critical thing is to tell a story of transformation, how acting on climate change is both necessary and desirable, and how it links to our other priorities as a society, like jobs, health, and fundamentally well-being. And obviously this story of transformation is never more important than now, when we're in the worst economic and health crisis that we've ever felt. So there's speaking out, and then there's engagement. So, you know, lots of people are experts on decarbonisation, but those experts are not expert in people's lives. And I think that we should have the humility to ask people to work with experts to design climate action that works for them. And that's very much the spirit behind this incredible experiment that I've been part of this past year, Climate Assembly UK. That's where we took 110 citizens selected to be representative of the country as a whole in terms of educational background, age, gender, ethnicity, geography, and attitude to climate change. And they heard evidence on climate, talked about possible solutions, and offered their recommendations to government. I'd really recommend a read of their report, which I can put a link in the chat when I've finished. But all my experience of these initiatives has shown me that when you give people the space to learn, to think, to discuss, citizens can offer up a really comprehensive and often actually quite radical set of answers to a tricky question. So I would suggest that processes like Climate Assembly UK and the many processes that have happened at local levels as well can be used not to replace democracy, not to replace representative democracy, not instead of voting, but as well as voting, as a supplement to improve the way that democracy works. Because, you know, we all know that a vote every 5 years is a very blunt instrument. It's a pretty limited way of telling politicians what sort of a world you want to live in. So I'd really like to see those deliberative processes built into our democracy as an inbuilt requirement, and for them to just become part of the way we do politics, as much for COVID recovery as for climate. And in my final 2 minutes, I just want to say what this means we can all do as individuals, and it very much reflects those things that I've just talked about. The first thing is for you as an individual to speak out, and particularly, you know, with people who you might not naturally have this conversation with. There's an organisation called Climate Outreach who've done some brilliant work on how to have a climate conversation. I'd really recommend their stuff. Secondly, talk to your MP and local elected representatives. I won't say any more about that because Rachel is the foremost expert on that. I do think protest is important. So, you know, if you feel able, I would absolutely protest. Difficult at the moment, of course, with the COVID restrictions, but protests over the past 2 years have honestly made such a difference. And there's a funny contradiction about protest, which is the least likely you are as a protester, the more you're listened to. So if you sort of appear as a stereotypical protester, I know this is you know, not necessarily as it should be, the less you get listened to, whereas people who aren't sort of usual protest suspects, like for example all the doctors and NHS staff who came out for Extinction Rebellion, they're listened to because it's sort of more surprising and less easy for a politician to pigeonhole. The last thing I'd say, which cuts across all those suggestions, is that this is absolutely a conversation, and it's really important. One of the things that deliberative processes do really well is start from where people are at with their views and values that they bring to the table and their own personal expertise. And it's absolutely crucial to make this a two-way conversation. And then bottom of my list, but also important, is the practical things that you can do to reduce your own carbon footprint. They are absolutely crucial, but they're actually more crucial in terms of being able to then give the message out to others and build the movement. So, you know, of course, eating less meat and using your car less is necessary, but its effect is hugely amplified if you talk about why you're doing that. So I think that the situation we're in right now with COVID makes it all the more critical to tackle the politics of climate change. It's not a case, I think, of holding back and waiting till our current crisis is over, because the opportunity for a climate-focused recovery from COVID is there for the taking. But what really worries me at the moment about politics is just because it's necessary to have a climate-focused economic recovery, just because we have the evidence that it needs to happen, doesn't mean that it will happen. The thing that makes a difference, I think, is getting the politics right, and getting the politics right does mean a huge effort from all of those of us who really care passionately about doing all we can to mitigate the climate crisis. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Rebecca. Rachel, you take the stage next.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you all this afternoon. As was mentioned, I work for Hope for the Future, which works to train, support and equip groups and individuals to build effective relationships with MPs around climate change. And in this 10 minutes, I'm going to speak to two things. Firstly, I'll make the case for taking the trouble to engage with MPs on the basis that change happens at the speed of trust. And secondly, I'll talk about a few of the principles of engagement that we use at Hope for the Future. But if you take anything at all away from what I say, let it be that there's an organisation out there which exists specifically to help you through the process of engaging effectively with your MP in your context, and we'd love for you to get in touch. I and my colleagues will be happy to arrange a phone conversation to work out the ways that we can support you, and I'll make sure that my email address goes in the chat. So firstly, you should engage with your MPs on the basis that change happens at the speed of trust. And I'd like you to think about the journey that you've taken to being here today, because I'd like to reckon that actually the vast majority of us are here because of our relationships with other people, whether that's friends or family or others who we respect, leading us to prioritising climate action. I know that's true for me, and I know that's true for others on this call. And actually, I think most change does happen at the prompting of someone or something that we trust. Now, unfortunately, within the wider context of our political system, it's characterised by high levels of mistrust and disillusionment in many cases also. And there are changes that need to happen on the systemic level. Sorry.
Can I butt in? Somebody says they'd like you to start. I don't know if you could just get your microphone, or it'd be a shame if we didn't all hear you.
Oh, so sorry, are there issues with my sound?
It's coming through okay for me.
Yeah, just a little bit closer.
You just slightly quiet, Rachel. Yeah.
Yeah,
Close to the mic, that may help. Go ahead.
Yeah, better? Great. I'll start from I don't know. I'll talk again a bit about the political system and levels of mistrust. So that's the broad system and the broad context in which things are operating. And there are changes that need to happen to improve that on the systemic level. But actually, I'm not going to talk so much about that so much as the individual context, because Hope for the Future works at the constituency level in the context that exists at present, and we try and help constituents build trust with MPs so that they take climate action. And we come across lots of constituents who feel powerless to affect change, but I think it's also really worth noting that that's the same for a lot of MPs as well. They often express things like, oh, it doesn't feel like my decision, it feels like the decision of whoever it is within my party that's making policy, or it feels like it lies with a government cabinet that they're not part of, etc. So our work at Hope for the Future is to overcome the barriers that exist on a very individual basis on the side of both the constituent and also the MP. And often our work means translating what is an incredibly multifaceted systemic need to action into very specific contexts and building trust over the longer term. And actually, we think this is worthwhile precisely because change happens at the speed of trust. And large businesses in key sectors will employ teams to manage relationships with stakeholders, including MPs, especially if a business is located within a particular constituency. I know from having worked in an MP's office, which had an airport within the constituency, how much effort was put into arranging regular meetings, sending through briefings at moments of legislative importance, and to make invitations for the MP to visit. And there's a reason that organisations do this and don't just send loads of general emails about, for example, the general benefits of aviation, but it's because they know it's more effective to build a good in-person relationship. So really Hope for the Future is trying to act as a resourcing pool for constituents, groups, individuals to build the same kind of quality of relationships so that MPs aren't only hearing from well-resourced briefings from high carbon industry sectors, but they know the concerns and ways of supporting their local constituency with the transition to zero carbon emissions, which needs to be made in the coming decades. So that's the first thing to say really, is that change happens at the speed of trust. That's why it's really worthwhile engaging on that very individual basis. So how do we do this? And here are a few very quick principles for working collaboratively with politicians on an individual level. And they go like this: arrange a meeting, find common ground, and create multiple opportunities for engagement. And you may be like, oh, this is really straightforward, I can do that. In which case, great, please go and do it. But if that sounds daunting, please just get in touch with Hope for the Future and we'll help. So the first thing, arrange a meeting. We always advise this over letters and emails because they allow for dialogue. Whatever you do, you're effectively inviting a response in kind. So if you send a 10-second email, actually it's very proportionate to get a 10-second response from the MP's office. But actually, if you've taken a few hours to thoughtfully form a personal letter to your MP alongside a group of others, if you've attached it nicely to an email, then actually what you're going to do is make the member of staff sat in that MP's office feel like, oh, they need to flag it to the MP for an individual response and schedule time for a meeting. And then once you're in a meeting itself, that's a really good venue for building an actual relationship, because it's a dialogue that can happen there and then. It's operating as a conversation. It's not a kind of binary back and forth or a dispute about a particular fact. Meetings mean that you can find out much more obviously where your MP is at. And we really encourage people to ask curious questions that you just wouldn't be able to get an email response to. Things like what an MP's individual priorities are within certain timeframes, or whether they prioritise one factor or over another, etc. And also, if you're making an ask of an MP, then you're asking it in person in a way that you can get an immediate response, and in a way that you can kind of tailor it to how your conversation has gone, and also get a commitment that you can then follow up with. It's much more meaningful. So that's the first thing. That's why we encourage meetings. Second of all is find common ground. What we would like is for you to be the constituent that your MP dreams of meeting. So you've got to think about what your MP is interested in. And a bit like Rebecca was talking about how this impacts on loads of other areas of society. MPs will be interested in things like jobs and healthcare or whatever. So if they have a specific interest, use that and connect it to what you want to talk about, because that way what you're saying will resonate so much more easily. And over time, when you have a relationship that's more established and there is that trust there, that's where you can start to challenge a little bit more and broaden out what you're talking about. But for like an initial conversation, what you're doing is focusing on building trust. And actually, just by virtue of the fact that you're meeting an MP, you're going to be within a particular category of someone who's very passionate about an issue. But sometimes we can end up a little bit like marathon runners, talking to a non-runner just about how great marathons are. And actually, if we want someone who doesn't run to run, then the best way is probably not to talk about marathons and how much you love marathons, but to tell them about Couch to 5K and what it is and how they can do it and how they can access it. And it's a bit like that with MPs who might have they have a broad understanding, but actually they don't really know how climate change relates to their constituency, or they don't really know how it relates to their very specific interest in one area of healthcare. And so if you can make that connection for them in a way that they trust you, then you're going to get a lot further with them. And then you can celebrate with them taking that first step or their equivalent of Couch to 5K. And then once they've done that, take them on to the next thing. And that leads me to the last thing about creating multiple opportunities for engagement. So within Hope for the Future, we have lots of different streams of projects. So mine is the faith project and work, but there's also schools and media and councils. And actually what we find is really effective is for an MP to access the issue of climate change from lots of different perspectives across their constituency. So they go to a schools workshop, and then they're invited to a panel event hosted by a local church, and then they get asked to write something in the local media, and suddenly they're seeing like a very broad support across all the different areas within their constituency, and they start to build a bit of a framework for climate issues and how they can take action on it, and then they'll start to prioritise it within their parliamentary work. So I know I've gone through that really quickly. The main things are change happens at the speed of trust. So it's really worth building trust with an MP and politician of whatever nature, and that you should arrange a meeting, find common ground, and create multiple opportunities for engagement. And the more creative you can make that, the better. And I'll be happy to answer questions and also answer emails after this event is over as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I've seen questions flooding by in the chat, so we'll have stuff to talk about later. Jenny, can I hand over to you now?
Hi there. So I'm going to pick up from Rachel's points there, and I'm going to talk more about how you can use those same approaches within your organisations. So regardless of what professional networks or businesses or local communities you're part of, there are chances to influence all sorts of decision makers in different ways. So I'm going to talk from a railway perspective about 3 places where we have really taken a what if approach to imagining how things could be different and getting a deeper understanding of the problems that we face through listening to more voices. So the first area that I want to look at is about trees and vegetation. So you're driving along and you're looking out the train window and you can see lots of trees next to the line. You probably think they're quite pretty, right? If you're a train driver, however, you see the trees and you think, if there's a storm and one of those trees comes down and goes on the line and I drive into it, I can't stop and I can't steer around it because I'm on a track. So that's absolutely terrifying, right? That's one of our biggest safety risks, and drivers are absolutely terrified by it. So that means that the maintenance staff tend to have a look at the trees and think, they're a bloody nuisance. We've got to keep chopping them down. We've got to manage that vegetation so it's not in the way of any of the signals. It's not likely to fall over onto the track, and it's not likely to damage any of the overhead cables and things like that. But then if you look at it from another perspective, perhaps your house looks out onto a railway line, and you look at the trees at the end of the garden and you quite like them, you enjoy the birds, and then one day the trees are gone. Suddenly you can see the trains going past and it feels like you can hear a lot more noise than you used to, because you get both a visual and an audible impact of the trains going past, which are shielded by those trees. So actually those trees are doing a whole range of different things. And one of the changes of perspective that has happened in the last few years is that a lot of people raised significant concerns that the way that the railway was managing that vegetation was really focused on the railway's point of view. It was really focused on the train drivers and the maintenance staff trying to manage a safety risk. But what we didn't see, though, was that we have a national linear nature reserve. We have something which allows us to join up a whole range of different habitats across the country and allows animals to migrate via those bits of habitat. And in the most nature depleted country in Europe, every bit of habitat that we could make more biodiverse and able to contribute to that thriving of biodiversity, we've got to do everything we can to look after it. But funnily enough, the railway has never had any biodiversity targets. It wasn't required to look after biodiversity other than compliance with the law. So obviously we checked for bird nests before we cut the trees down, because you need to do that under the law. And we thought we were pretty good, actually. We thought we took a pretty decent approach to ecology surveys and generally trying to do the right thing. And we found people asking questions in Parliament, spurred on by a huge outcry in the local media from local people who saw trees being chopped down and said, you haven't talked to us about this. You haven't explained to us why you're doing that. You haven't engaged and helped us to see how what you're doing is the best way of managing your ecology. And what was fantastic is a QC was asked to produce a report. It's called the Barley Report. It's available online. I'll put a link in the chat. And that was published in 2018. And the way it looked at it from all of those different perspectives, and it asked people, it asked the railway, but also the Department for Transport, to set some different targets and to start looking at vegetation in a different way. And I'm pleased to say that we are now working towards no net loss within the next couple of years, getting a fantastic baseline of all of our ecology across the whole network. And then we're working towards no net gain, which will be written into our license from the next funding agreement. So I think that's a massive change in just a couple of years. And a lot of people and the media helped make that happen and helped change a mindset around what we can do. So a second area is race and gender equality. So I have to say that the Black Lives Matter protests this year took me a bit by surprise, but we've seen just how baked in inequalities are making some people in this country much poorer, much more exposed to coronavirus, much more exposed to air pollution, and much more likely to die earlier than everybody else. And I think there's a growing recognition from across the country that actually we're not happy with that. We don't want that to be the way that people's lives are being lived. And so from an internal perspective, it led to a lot of soul searching. Network Rail was one of the first companies to publish an ethnicity pay gap report. And well, I'm glad we published the report, but it didn't show that we were shining stars, okay? And then we looked at race, we did an internal review of all of the data for the last couple of years for our employment. And we found, if you asked me before I saw this data how we were doing, I would have said, well, I think we're doing our best. I now look at the data and I think there's a lot more we need to do. And what's changing is that we're bringing people together in focus groups to learn from what is holding people back. Why is it that we're continuing to struggle to recruit people into roles that Black people are applying for jobs at Network Rail at twice the rate of white people, and they are getting 50% less jobs at the end of the process, okay? So they are massively being screened out by unconscious bias. And that was one of the key findings of the report. And I think if you did repeat that in other companies, you'd probably find something similar. I don't think it's just the railway that's racist. But we didn't think we had a big problem. And we've also got a reverse mentoring set up. So for the next 6 months, every member of our executive leadership team has somebody from within the company who comes from a different background. We've got somebody with an experience of disability, we've got people who've come from sort of gender and low income backgrounds, and we've also got a range of different ethnic backgrounds, explaining what it's actually like being a person with that experience within Network Rail. And then if you look at the external side of it, if we want infrastructure that meets people's needs, we've got to involve those people in making that infrastructure. You'd think that was obvious, but if you have a look at Sustrand's Cycling for Everyone report and Wheels for Wellbeing inclusive cycling reports, what they show is that we've got an image in our head of what a cyclist looks like in this country. And that image is completely different from the one that my parents have in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, everybody cycles and it doesn't matter who you are. In the UK, the common picture of a cyclist is someone who's on 2 wheels, not 3 or even 4, on a self-powered bike or a cargo bike or one with those kids things on the front. And they are doing it because typically we're talking about blokes who are confident at cycling on the road. We're not talking about children, we're not talking about elderly people, we're not talking about people with disabilities. And interestingly, women and people from ethnic minorities and people from low income areas all feel massively excluded from cycling. And again, I didn't know this, but I led a session last week with a disabled cyclist from Wheels for Wellbeing, and we went through the data with a whole range of Network Rail engineers, and we talked about what we need to do differently. And I just encourage you to try and get out there, find things that help people look at the problem from a different perspective, and then bring that into the conversation with your teams. And you don't necessarily have to go company-wide to all of the engineers in the business straight away. You could go with a smaller group of people first. And when we were talking about building up trust, I think that's a really good way of doing that. And then finally, I'll go to decarbonisation. So I'd just like to put on record that I absolutely love the folks who were willing to go out on the streets with Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, because you have completely changed the tone of the conversation in Network Rail. I spent years in Network Rail banging the drum saying, our weather's getting worse, we're at serious risk because, I mean, I look after earthworks and drainage, so flooding and slope failure is a fact of my life, and it is getting measurably worse year on year, and it's getting year on year more dangerous. So we've been kind of saying, give us a bit more money, help us to cope with this problem, but also can we stop adding to the problem, please? And finally, in the last 18 months to 2 years, that has changed. We are now on a pathway with science-based targets agreed and about to be published, so that we have committed to achieving the zero carbon by 2050. We're dealing with all the technical challenges that goes along with, but I would say that there's so much to do. You know, there's a whole lot of mobilization that we've been doing to bring people together who want to solve the problem and get them talking about what their contribution to the problem is. There's a lot of upskilling. There's also a lot of pilot projects and scaling those pilot projects up. But I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to say that public pressure outside in the public sphere can make a huge difference to your ability to make change happen within organisations that you're already part of. And those same techniques of building trust, talking, finding out where people are coming from and what their perspectives are, and helping them to see how an environmental focus can help the business along, that makes a big difference. All right.
Great, thank you, Jenny. It's interesting to hear how that public pressure has made a difference. I've certainly encountered that at work with the Black Lives Matter protests and so on, accelerating the work we were already doing in diversity and inclusion. Right, over to Geoff. So, Geoff, what got you into climate?
Well, I was a science teacher. Before I retired in 2007, climate change was on my syllabus. I knew it was important, but campaigning hadn't occurred to me. A year after I retired, our daughter got arrested for stopping a coal train delivering to Drax power station. Well, I was angry and shocked. How dare you take the law into your own hands, daughter? Our democracy is fragile. Why throw away your opportunities for a great career? But Dad, haven't you heard of climate change? Excuse me, I'm a science teacher. But Dad, it's urgent. Well, she had an article in The Guardian that said, we don't have 30 years. The scientific consensus is Earth will warm by 2 degrees, then 3, 4. It's about a planet largely uninhabitable. I thought she was exaggerating because that wasn't clearly put in my modern A-level textbook. So I did my own research using the Met Office, Royal Society, NASA, the World Meteorological Organization, and the science was absolutely clear. Sorry, daughter, you were right.
So, situation, but there's not much action on CO2 emissions. How do you feel about that, Geoff?
Well, I was alerted by Professor Robert White, a Christian guy, professor of geophysics at Cambridge, who in his book writes, there's been a targeted process of denial and misinformation backed by millions of dollars and instigated by industries with vested interests. And another Christian, Nobel Prize winner Sir John Houghton, who worked with Mrs. Thatcher to set up one of the world's leading climate research centres and was a chair for the IPCC, He writes in his autobiography how he refused to shake the hand of one of the delegates in the IPCC. Why would a lovely Christian gentleman to do that? Because the delegate was deliberately obscuring the science. So the penny dropped for me. Science is serious and real, but there's so much disinformation out there.
So what was your next step then?
We joined Transition Lincoln. We found them to be brilliant as a supportive group, doing lots of very positive things in the community. We tried to engage with our MP and got nowhere, but I did feel that we needed to do a lot more politically. People who wanted to do the right thing had so many barriers in their way.
Well, earlier I introduced you as a self-appointed agitator. How did that happen, and what does it mean?
Well, I just got on with doing stuff. I figured that the community I identified with most clearly would be my church, so that's where I began. I thought they'd accept the science. I tried to persuade my vicar to use eco-church, and I wrote to my bishop. I thought they'd understand it was a gospel and a justice issue, but I didn't get anywhere. We were very much encouraged by the work of Christian Aid and Tear Fund and our Rocha and Green Christian, so we just kept going. In 2015, a group of us had the chance to meet one of our bishops. He was welcoming and supportive, but too busy to keep going with us. So our little faith and environment group organised a conference. We had 20 attenders. We got lots more contact that way. And in the next 2 or 3 years, we organised more annual conferences and other events. In 2016, Christian Aid and Tear Fund invited my wife and I to be part of a mentoring project, and they encouraged us to engage purposefully with influential individuals in our community. So we kept on it. In 2016, our bishop went to a conference in Fiji and had an epiphany. He met a climate scientist. He met people who were suffering the realities of climate change. And he wrote on the diocesan website, "Now I understand with my heart, we've got to play our part in reducing global warming." So that gave me another chance to engage with our bishop, and our little group was reconvened. We've now got a diocesan environmental advisory panel and a diocesan policy. The bishop then organised with the University of Lincoln a big international conference, Moana, in 2019, with climate change experts speaking. So armed with the outcomes of that conference, I went lobbying my representatives to the C of E General Synod. And then, of course, in 2020, they agreed a target of 2030 for net zero. So I'm hoping that that target is going to help the church to take seriously climate change and to engage politically.
It's definitely some. Hopefully we don't need every bishop to fly off to Fiji to get their climate epiphany. So you also joined Extinction Rebellion. Why did you do that?
I did that. We initially felt very ambivalent about it, or I did. But then the IPCC report came out in 2018, and the biodiversity report came out a year later. And we saw Rowan Williams' letter in the paper supporting Extinction Rebellion. So we decided to take a look. In Extinction Rebellion in Lincoln, we met lovely people who'd been active in the Wildlife Trust, in Transition Lincoln and other groups for a long time. And they understood the urgency of it and the need to change. And I was impressed by their commitment to peaceful, direct action. So we took part in Extinction Rebellion rebellions in London, engaging with the public, and contrary to what you might read in the press, had a lot of very positive responses, even thanks on the street. We discovered climate action, and then, as you know, by 2019, Parliament declared a climate emergency, and we had a National Citizens' Assembly set up. So I counted that as success.
Indeed. You haven't just been doing that protest stuff and the church stuff. You've also been engaging with politics, both at a local level and with your MP. So how did that happen, and what was?
Well, I'm a Labour Party member, so I agitated in the Labour Party. They let me do a presentation about climate change and asked me back to do another one to say what would Lincoln look like as a sustainable city. And I think that helped in what happened later in the city. In 2017, we had a new MP. So our transition group organised a public meeting in support of Climate Coalition Speak Up campaign, and we invited our new MP. She came and was keen to learn. And then shortly after, she was talking about climate change in Parliament. I counted that as a great success. But she also told us in that meeting that we organised, Lincoln needs an environment task force. And I planted that thought in my head and thought we'll use that later. And then another little coincidence, a local church, a church group in the city with a passion for climate justice organised a prayer breakfast and invited civic leaders to come and talk about the challenges they face. The city council leader said their priority is climate change. You could have knocked me over with a feather. I'd been hoping for that sort of opening. So off I went and met the council leader. And he said to me, "You're going to tell me to put your money where your mouth is, aren't you?" I thought, well, maybe. So I asked him, would he support me to take a group of people from Lincoln to Leeds to meet people who led the Leeds Climate Commission with a view to setting up a similar commission in Lincoln? And his answer was yes. That process began. So 6 months later, I went back to the council leader and said, we've now got the beginnings of a climate commission, engaging with major employers in the town, with the university, with all sectors in the city. Would he now consider acknowledging a climate emergency for the council? So on the council website, we've now got the declaration that I helped to draft.
Excellent, that's good. And so based on your experience then, how would you advise people to act? You've tried a range of different things. What's the way forward for people?
I don't think there's a magic answer. I think all forms of action count. Writing to your MP is not difficult, and there are lots of ways to get help for that. We've heard from Rachel about that. I think we need to get ourselves informed and help others to get informed. We need to grasp how urgent the situation is and how rapidly we need to cut our emissions. Personal lifestyle is urgently important, but I think we need to acknowledge that all of us doing our little bit is definitely not sufficient to meet the UN's 1.5 degree target. We do need political change. So we need to talk about it. And we need to show there's a much better way of living. We need to connect with nature. We need to connect with our community, because we're going to need strong communities in the things that are going to face us. We need to join with others to get encouragement and support in our own lifestyle changes and political action. And we need to try to engage with potential movers and shakers in our own sphere of contact with a view to specific action. So we have to focus on what we want to achieve. And my eye is, and I think our eye should be on COP26. And in connection with that, I think the church needs to give massive support to the CEE bill. We mustn't give up.
Thank you, Geoff. It's inspiring to hear how much change you've created. If we had someone doing that in every town and city across the UK, we'd be making some progress. I wanted to just ask a quick question before we go to stuff from the audience. We've heard mention of the things going on like Climate Assembly UK and going and talking to our MPs and so on. But there's a feeling I've had, and I think others have, that sometimes the process is a bit too slow. And I just wondered, I guess especially Rachel or Rebecca, can you comment on what can be done to process up? Especially thinking back to in an earlier session, Rob Hopkins said he felt the last election was a kind of fork in the path, and people like, oh, well now we've got this government for 5 years. So what options remain to us in that we, given that we need to do things quickly in an ecosystem?
Do you want me to have a go at that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd come back to is that it seems much slower. If this is basically about reaching out to people who are not yet grasping or acting on the severity of the climate crisis, right? And that is, you know, that counts for a lot of politicians, a lot of people in power, and a decent chunk of the population as well. So that is going to be a slow process, but and at the same time we can do things which feel and are, you know, feel quicker, like protest. And like your own lifestyle change. So maybe it's about balancing the quick with the slow, but I absolutely think that we need to do this, the democracy stuff, even if it seems a little bit cumbersome, because, you know, I don't see an alternative, because I actually think that if we are, if we neglect those people who don't yet understand the severity of the climate crisis, we risk actually turning it into a more partisan issue. You know, we risk turning it into a sort of us and them situation. And that's why I really, really admire the work of organisations like Hope for the Future and faith groups who've done a lot of this in the past, who do actually, you know, start as a conversation and do that reaching out, even though it seems sort of, you know, very, very painstaking. It's absolutely necessary, not as an alternative to you know, the rapid stuff and the shouting, but as part of the ecosystem of change.
Thank you, Rebecca. Rachel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm basically inclined to agree with the gist that Rebecca's just given. I think it's really, there have been so many different deadlines over the years of this is the crucial time, this is the crucial moment, and I think the danger of focusing on particular periods of time is that inevitably it can lead you to feelings of despair if that moment passes, or you then take it less seriously if the next chunk of time then happens. And actually there isn't like one particular moment. We know that like actually the more emissions there are, the worse it is. There isn't like a specific moment, and I think it's actually quite, it is a form of arrogance essentially to believe that we know, we don't know. And so all we can do is try our hardest. And I really liked this phrase that is slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I think that links to some of the democratic angle of this, is that actually what we want is a smooth transition, and some of that isn't going to be quick. We want it to be quick, and it might not feel quick, but actually making sure that we're careful with the foundations is really important. And so this isn't an either or. It's not let's do it, let's focus on doing it slowly, etc. But it's a kind of like, can we hold these things in tension? And I think over the coming years, we are going to have to get used to holding a lot of these things in tension.
And one that I can maybe bring Geoff in, if you could comment on, both Rachel and Rebecca, that is. Thinking back to the Extinction Rebellion demands, you know, during 2019, government set up a climate emergency. Parliament declared a climate emergency, although that didn't carry any weight with government. There was the Citizen Assembly set up on climate change, but without the ability to give any kind of binding recommendations. And the net zero declaration for 2050 rather than 2025. Geoff, did you feel that they were successes, failures, and where does it leave you feeling you need to go next on that?
I think they were successes in the sense that they were milestones in the right direction. I think that the 2030 target is essential. I don't think it's any sense of saying to ourselves it's not realistic. I think the model of the Citizens Assembly is really, really helpful. The outcomes from it were extremely encouraging. The discouraging part of it is they were predicated, as I understand it, on a 2050 target, not a 2030 target. And so I would like to think that certainly in the church context, where people have divergent political views, we can hopefully promote the idea of citizens' assemblies as a way of circumventing the political impasse and getting a citizens' assembly which will have a higher target.
Yeah. Now, Rebecca, you've been involved in the Climate Assembly. Do you feel there ought to be where do we go next? Ought there to be another one? How should government act on the recommendations that have come out from that? What's the way forward? Yeah,
so on the specific issue of the target, that links directly back to the UK's legislative target of net zero by 2050, and the job that you know, the team, including myself, were asked to do is to run a citizens' assembly about how we reach that legislative target. So we didn't actually pass judgment on the 2050 target as such, but that was what the discussions were aimed towards. You absolutely could have a citizens' assembly about what the target date should be. My own view on that is that it was actually really helpful in Climate Assembly to be able to delve into some of that detail about the actual practicalities of how you reach a target, and that you know, you can play target politics a lot, but actually getting into some of those practicalities is really, really important. And what we're seeing now with the current government is that, I mean, you know, let's just bank this for a moment. They have remained through thick and thin rhetorically committed to the 2050 target, and that is really quite something. They don't have a coherent plan for that 2050 target, and of course it's absolutely right that the science says the sooner we can do it the better. So, you know, 2050 in the face of the science, you know, is you know, at best a compromise. But I think the battle now has to be looking at what implementation measures we need, and to get that same level of sort of urgency into the discussion about the practicalities about what we do. And you know, politically, I think that's where we really need to focus. Just one example of that, I'm staggered that there isn't more attention paid to fossil fuel extraction in the UK. So, you know, oil and gas in Scotland, just down the road from me in Cumbria, a new coal mine. And you know, it's inconceivable that these projects are in line with net zero by 2050, let alone 2030. So we need to be, you know, these need to be the political battlegrounds for me.
Yeah, definitely. Rachel, from your point of view on engaging with MPs, is the output of the Climate Assembly useful at an individual local MP level, and how can it be used?
Yeah, I think it's useful because it gives I'm going to term it like social intelligence. It's a way of gauging things just outside of people's own little bubbles and saying, well, actually, when information was presented in a particular way, this is the outcome and this is the level of support. And a lot of MPs do have particular ideas of what they think has popular support that actually maybe aren't in line with what they actually are. And I think a really good example of that is the levels of support for like offshore and onshore wind energy. MPs, I think, consistently underestimate the amount of support there is out there for that. I would be wary of bashing MPs with particular statistics because I don't think that will go well. But if you can intelligently present what's happening from trusted sources, and actually Climate Assembly UK is a very trusted source that MPs will listen to and be very happy with, so is the Committee on Climate Change, then that's a really important tool that you should use as much as you can.
Yeah, so a few questions on engaging with MPs then. I mean, a practical one that's come from the audience is, yeah, someone's MP has started virtual coffee mornings during lockdown. Are they useful as group meetings, or do you really want individual?
So yeah, they're better than nothing for sure. I think one of the things that can be difficult is that if you're on a call and you don't know the other people and there's no central coordination or facilitation other than the MP, then they can be a bit scattered, and it can mean that there's no actual outcome from those individual meetings other than just the conversation. I think the conversation is a really good start, but if you're part of something like that, what I would advise doing is asking other participants if there's an option for this. If you can be in touch outside of the meeting. We've done some work at Hope for the Future with people who've been along to the Time It's Now kind of lobby meetings where they've just turned up, and there have been lots of other constituents and they've all asked individual questions, but it hasn't been focused. But then subsequent to that, they've been in touch, thought about their priorities as a group, gone back to the MP, met again, presented a specific ask that the MP has then accepted, and that is a much, I don't know, clearer way of getting an MP to commit and actually take action as a result of that meeting.
Now, I imagine when you go and talk to an MP for the first time, their reaction is going to be a mixture of the party line, their own views they had before they became an MP, their elected, their thoughts about their career progression as a politician. There could be a really complex mix there. Is there any way of kind of researching what buttons need to be pressed before you go and do that meeting?
Yeah, we definitely recommend that you do research that. That's actually something that if you get in touch with Hope for the Future, we'll produce what we call internally a tailored lobbying strategy. And that is, we'll help you with all of that background research, give you an overview, and then from that point be like, okay, how does that line up with your interests, and how can we create an initial conversation that fits with your MP, fits with where you're at, and matches those kind of things and does that background research for you.
Brilliant. That sounds like that would be really useful. I could have done with that myself if I'd thought about it a couple of years back. So to turn to Jenny, and Jenny, you won't be surprised that HS2 has been mentioned. And of course, that isn't just a rail project, it's a political project as well. I mean, the question is, we've seen, that there's people perhaps in this meeting who have been protesting against HS2, people who have. And there's been the stuff in the news recently about this slightly unusual experiment in trying to relocate a whole woodland. How do you sit with you? And I realise you're not going to be speaking on behalf of your employer when you talk here.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the first thing to say is that HS2 is a completely separate company, so I don't work for HS2. However, from an environmentalist point of view, I think we do need to appreciate that there are actually some really good green arguments for constructing new railway lines in the UK. There are huge popular support for reopening lines that were closed under beaching, for example. Things like East-West Rail and Borders Rail have been hugely successful. And what they've done is they have allowed for modal shift. Because one of the biggest challenges that we face is actually the success of rail travel in the last 20 or 30 years. The number of people using the trains has doubled in 20 years. We're expecting it to double again in another 10. And if you look at the car travel and the journeys that could be made by train, which are currently made by cars, if you'd replaced only 10% of those car journeys with train journeys, you need to double the number of train services. And that's really difficult when the tracks are full. And fundamentally, we are butting up against the congestion problem in the UK rail network. We're running more trains now than we ever have before, faster than we've ever done before. And unfortunately, we have 200-year-old infrastructure because we were the first people to build railway. So there is a limit to how fast you can drive over an old bridge, okay? So if you build a new railway line, you're going to build it so that it's got the highest capacity possible. And the entire reason for doing HS2 is about capacity rather than speed, which I've always thought is a huge problem with its name, okay? So if you look at people travelling north out of Euston on, say, a Friday night, you can't get a seat on the train, ever. There's currently 10,000 spaces for people to go north. That includes the standing people, okay? With HS2, there will be 30,000 every hour going north out of London. Now, I appreciate that the first phase from London to Birmingham, you look at that and you think, well, I don't need to make that journey faster, but actually what you need to do is to separate the commuter traffic, the stopping trains and the freight trains away from the fast services, which are going all the way to Scotland. And if we were able to separate them by building a new set of tracks for at the same
Jenny, we're losing your sound a bit.
For doing it. Now, I'd also like to point out that there are significant challenges with building a new railway line through a very congested country with a lot of people and a lot of fantastic nature. Effectively, if you don't go through the middle of someone's house, you're probably going through a nature reserve. And that is a problem with linear infrastructure. I think the first phase of HS2, they've done quite a lot of good work to try and mitigate that. They've got quite a lot more to do in the next two phases, which aren't completely tied down yet. And I think we should continue to protest and argue for doing that biodiversity protection and enhancement as much as possible as part of the scheme. And I really hate the way that it's become very us and them, because I think there's an opportunity for this to be a real partnership.
Can I just come in with a couple of other questions that are coming in related to this?
Yeah.
Some from earlier on and some just in the last few minutes. So this is around the broader capacity that, you know, we've got existing railways and perhaps money could be spent on upgrading tracks and signalling greater capacity on existing railways. And a related question is about the lines that Beeching cut decades ago, whether there's any realistic possibility of bringing some of them back. So are there things that could be done? And I suppose if you can comment on two things. One is could these things be done practically and financially? But then how do we go about persuading them to happen? Because I presume we don't come and bang on Network Rail's door. Does it come back to us going through our MPs again?
Yeah, so the Beeching cuts, I would say, primarily affect regional railways. So there's a huge amount that we can do to improve accessibility of railway lines to more people, as well as taking some of the lines which are currently freight only and converting them to passenger use. So we've got 5 new railway stations being built in Birmingham in the next 10 years, which are specifically for the purposes of taking what used to be freight lines and converting them for passenger use. And there's also a line which is going to become a tram route. So a huge number of more people connected to the railway network as a result of that work. In terms of what can we do to the existing network, we've literally spent the last 20 years trying to get rid of all our bottlenecks. There are very significant technical and cost constraints to doing any more. And the biggest problem we've got if you do that on an extremely busy railway line, the only time you've got to do it on a Saturday night for 8 hours, and you're lucky if you get 8 hours.
So coming to
you close the railway line for the weekend, every weekend for the next 3 years. And we did try that the last time we upgraded the West Coast Main Line. It didn't go so well.
So coming to the point about how to create change, and one of the other questions that came up, which one I'd never thought of. I've often tried to take my bike on a train, sometimes succeeded, sometimes not. Someone asked, what about people who can't ride a bike and they ride a trike? How do you get a trike onto a train? So when we want change, what I'm thinking, and obviously that's train operating companies, not Network Rail. But with either, what is the best way to try and affect change, whether it's on the network or on the trains themselves?
So I'd say there's a couple of different approaches. So the first approach is to go through the train operators and writing to your local train operator about what you want them to do does make a difference. The second area is to bring that through local politics, because if your local MP starts making representations that we need to have better provision for people, that makes a difference. You can go through groups like Campaign for Better Transport and get your experience sort of magnified through advocacy. I mean, Wheels for Wellbeing is a fantastic little charity that's done a lot of advocacy work for people who use all manner of different bikes. So one of my objectives was to bring those stories to a railway audience, because I wanted to change the perspective of people about what they're designing for. Because I mean, if you design your whole railway network around the idea that if someone, occasionally people might turn up on a cycle, and if they do, it's only a 2-wheeler, you're not going to provide the same level of infrastructure as you get in Utrecht, where there are 40,000 cycle spaces, which many of them are suitable for you to turn up with a trike or a cargo bike or an adapted cycle of many different kinds.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's a huge amount of discussion going on HS2. We could have a whole separate panel on that, couldn't we? I think, which is no surprise.
Asking questions about commuting, I think we need to reinvent the railway network for a different way of travelling. I think we should be thinking a lot more about local travel and about enabling people to use it for longer journeys on an occasional basis rather than on a daily basis.
Yeah, definitely. Back to talking to MPs again, because obviously we've looped back into that thinking, well, if we want change on trains, then MPs are going to be part of how it happens. Some of the questions have been about, there's two two extremes we might get when talking to an MP. Some might be completely opposed to what we want to talk to them about, whether it's climate or HS2, and others might be completely on board. What are the best things we can do in both of those cases? If they're completely opposed and if they're already on side, how can we support them in that case? Rachel, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, I mean, the first thing is to be minded that you're going to be playing a long game in some respects. I think if you go into a 20-minute meeting with an MP expecting to complete 180, you're going to be disappointed. So you really need to think about, okay, how can I map this out and take them on a journey across maybe 2 or 3 meetings on this particular thing and bring them further alongside. And that's something that we can help you think about in terms of like breaking that down. If your MP is super on board on an issue, but again, you're like, I don't know where to take that. I would look at like how you can, first of all, make your MP a real pioneer in a particular area. So beyond them just like agreeing with with the words that they say, but actually being like, okay, how can we use the MP's support to influence other things happening within the constituency? For example, the council, or like, for example, particular constituency events, or getting something like a climate assembly happening within a particular regional area. I've also seen the things happen where people create networks or alliances across a particular region and then use the strength of support from one MP to influence neighbouring MPs. Now that is quite difficult to do and takes a lot of energy, but it can be done. So yeah, get in touch with us again if you want to think a bit more about that. And again, if they're really opposed to an issue, then it's a case of finding common ground, becoming really critical and knowing that you can be part of that journey, but you probably can't be the whole journey. And if you are the whole journey, it's going to take you time. So being realistic about that, it can be done. So yes, I would say have a go at it.
Yeah, brilliant. Another kind of political.
I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Rebecca. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree absolutely, Rachel, and that makes a lot of sense. The other thing is that you know, just by turning up and talking about climate change, you are performing a function, which is to show to your MP that there is a concerned group of citizens out there, and that matters if they are, you know, if they're not into climate at all, because that will make them worried that they're losing support, and it will reassure them if they are. So, you know, even if, and obviously I want you to do what Rachel does and develop a conversation, but even if you just, you know, turned up to one meeting and said that you were motivated to come and talk to your MP about climate, you've already achieved something.
Yeah. Now, another question following on from this, which is probably for Rebecca, but also Rachel as well, I think. So there's two kind of linked together. One, how much difference would proportional representation make to speeding up action on climate change? And is that an important thing to campaign on? Of course, I'm aware we did have a kind of vote on that some years ago through. And another question relating to that is that while we have the first past the post electoral system, a lot of people will never get an MP who their views at all, and I know, you know, that there's a feeling that sometimes there maybe isn't any party you want to vote for in your constituency, or nationally even perhaps, and you know, if there was someone who wanted to be an MP on a climate and ecology issue, it would be very difficult for them to get into politics without aligning themselves with one of the major parties. So given these things about PR and first past the post, is any comments on, you know, do we need a deeper reform of democracy, and is that something that's worth us campaigning on, or are the climate and ecosystem timescales just too short for us to worry about that at the moment?
Do you want me to start on that and then
go ahead?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I think first past the post is problematic in that it disenfranchises people, and it also makes MPs in safe seats lazy, although less lazy than they've been in the past, because we've seen such changes recently. I think the other area of democratic reform is, of course, the House of Lords. I mean, personally, I would love to see the House of Lords instead replaced with with essentially citizens selected by lottery, who might, you know, serve their role the same way that you do jury service, but be properly funded and supported to do so. I mean, both those things are quite plausible, but I sort of slightly balk at the idea that we have to get the democracy right before we can then go on to climate. So I think that's too much. You know, we were talking about quick, slow earlier. That actually feels too slow for me. So I think we have to be working with the inadequate system that we've got. And a small, you know, a small silver lining of the inadequate system we've got is that MPs are in the British system, they are in the UK system, they are responsive to constituents because they have that role to place. And so, you know, the constituency surgery model is pretty unique actually, and really vital that we use that link, and getting that link to place is I think part of the climate solution. So we may as well use the best aspects of the system we've got as well as trying to make it better.
Rachel, did you want to come in on that as well?
No, I have nothing to add.
Right. I'm aware this might be one I missed in the chat. There was a comment about the Cumbrian mine thing, and I think Rebecca, you might have replied to that in the chat. But I'm quite just interested to elaborate on it for everyone in case they missed that. So when there's something like a mine going on in Cumbria, you know, I object to it, but I live down in East. Is there any point in me talking to my MP about a mine in Cumbria, or is it down to the local people talking to their MP? What are the different ways people could collaborate on trying to create action on something like that coal mine?
Yeah, so I think I was about to say the good thing about the coal mine, the good thing about the coal mine is that it does provide a very stark example of where our climate policy is going very wrong. So the Climate Change Act, which you'll probably know about, which, you know, the net zero target is part of that act, is good at setting a direction of travel in terms of targets and carbon budgets, but it's very, very weak on saying what individual government departments or local areas need to do as a result. There's very little track back from the target into different policies, different departments and different local areas. And the coal mine is a really stark example. The fact that, you know, the fact that local councillors are allowed to decide on something which results in 9 million tonnes a year of emissions. So in terms of what everyone else can do, I think they can use that as an example of what needs to change. They can absolutely state their opposition to the mine, to their MP, to, you know, whoever else, and ask their MP to, you know, to support a ban on fossil fuel extraction, or, you know, the more generalised thing. So I think using it as an example is really powerful.
Rachel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think actually one of the things that just came up there was about we've got some centralised targets, but there's no good maths on how that actually carries down into local areas, and that makes it really difficult for having like an actual centralised coordinated plan that's going to get us to net zero in any sensible way. And actually what it reminds me of is a recent Institute for Government report, which if people are interested in this sort of area, it's quite long, it's like 95 pages, but I think it is worth looking at. So I'll put that in the chat.
Great, thank you. And just to add, Rachel did post her email in the chat earlier because she's aware there might be more than we have time to get through because we're nearly at the end of question time now. Geoff, I just wanted to check in with you. You've mentioned earlier that you'd worked with your MP. Do you have any insights to share, commenting on what Rachel and Rebecca have been saying about working with MPs? What was your experience and starting the conversation, finding common ground, that kind of thing?
I think I would bow to the far superior knowledge of Rachel and Rebecca, but our experience was that one MP wasn't interested at all. And I think probably his main objection to us that he knew we were in a different political party. And he declared clearly that he didn't agree with the science of climate change. The other MP who responded very, very positively to us, we already knew and had already engaged with. So I think that points to the sort of thing that Rachel's been telling us about. You know, building from relationships. So I'm hoping that in Lincolnshire and in Lincoln, I can contact my church friends who belong to a different party from me to get onto the MP who's there at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the three of us in our constituency here did go and have a meeting with Amber Rudd when she was our MP, and yeah, it didn't particularly go anywhere, despite her having been involved in energy and climate change when the department was still called that. Right, so I want to now give each of the speakers a couple of minutes to share their reflections, because there may be other things that have occurred to them while we've been chatting that we haven't had time to go through yet. So Rachel, do you want to take a couple of minutes and just say, what would your closing thoughts be on this?
I think it'll be a little shorter than that. I think my main reflection is, I think it'd be really worth sorting out in your mind why you are taking action and what you want to achieve from it, because I think it can be quite easy when you're engaging politically to feel discouraged really quite quickly if you don't see immediate results. But actually, I would hope that people's faith is a big source of our motivation. And so I just encourage you to reflect on that and reflect why you want to act and how you want to act, and use that as your starting point that can then carry you along through the process of engagement. And also just a recommendation to get in touch, and we will do our best to support you through that process as well.
Great, yeah, it's really useful to hear that you're able to provide that support. I'll certainly make use of it in any future engagements I have with my MP. Rebecca, is there anything you'd like to say for closing thoughts?
I mean, I think this is, I think it's really important to remember that, you know, for everyone, it is climate is a very personal thing, as well as, you know, I mean, I spend my days working on it, right? And I know a lot of people on this call spend their days or evenings campaigning on it. And we've heard, you know, I was very moved really by Geoff's story around that. And I just think that the danger is that, I mean, it is true, right? Whatever we do on climate is not enough. That's what the science tells us. Like, we're never going to do enough. We've already reached 1 degree warming. And that's a really difficult thing to live with. And, you know, so, I mean, 2 things come out of that for me. The first is that it's really important to look after yourself in that process and look after the people that you work with. And, you know, we all have coping mechanisms. Mine is running with the dog and listening to rubbish podcasts. But that, you know, keeping a note on how it affects you personally is really important. And the other thing is to actually look at the progress that's been made. So, I mean, the climate politics has changed beyond all recognition over the last 2 years. Even in the US, the fact that there was a whole section of the presidential debate this week devoted to climate change, it's never happened before. The amount of airtime climate got in the December election last year, again, unprecedented. That's thanks to protests, it's thanks to the school strikers, it's thanks to everyone on this call and everyone that we all know and don't know who've been working on it. And I find that quite uplifting, actually. You know, I'm not saying we've cracked it at all, but I find it really important not to go into the sort of you know, doom-laden stuff too much about it's all too late or whatever, because every little bit we do counts, and every you know, every gram of greenhouse gases counts. So it's really great for me to be part of conversations like this amongst people who are, you know, all have the same energy and you know, want to find different but really really collaborative ways through this.
Brilliant, thank you, Rebecca. Geoff, what would you like to say to close? Oh, you've just muted yourself.
Sure. I'll go along with everything that's just been said. Every little action counts. You don't know what effect it's going to have, but just do it. I'd like to tell you about a poster that my daughter took to Extinction Rebellion in London. In Connect, and it was a literal baby grow for my grandson, and on it said, "Mummy, when I grow up, it will be too late." That's what we have to focus on.
Yeah, that's quite poignant, isn't it? Jenny, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say that really emphasizing what people have already said about you don't need to be an expert. So I have been interested in environmental issues and I've educated myself. And what surprises me constantly is that people now look at me as if I'm an expert because I've read more than they have. So, for example, 6 months ago, I started getting involved in Network Rail's rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I'm a civil engineer. I did not know a great deal about electric charging infrastructure or the power grid or the problems with batteries and the way that they produce hydrogen that I need to manage in the buildings, etc. But that's fine. I'm surrounded by people who know more than me, and I draw on their expertise and then I repeat it in the right places until the job gets done. And you can take that same approach. You don't need to be an expert to make a difference. You can massively influence change by keeping the focus on this is important and keep on bringing it up as well. And I'm really pleased actually that the tone of conversation has changed. So, I mean, I've presented to a group of rail industry suppliers in January, and they were asking me why we weren't going faster.
Yep, brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. I mean, just to the summary from myself of listening to this brilliant panel, you know, we've been reminded that we can make a difference to people about climate change, and climate outreach. The organisation can help us with doing that. That we need to get good at talking to our MP and can help equip us to do that really well. And we've been reminded that that the protests do make a difference. They do change the internal organisations, businesses, governments, whatever. And Geoff has given us a brilliant example of putting that into practice and actually going out and campaigning with different organisations and local and national government. So I'd just like to finally just say thank you to all of you for giving up your time this afternoon to join. Really valuable hearing from you, and it's been a great discussion. So if everyone can give a virtual round of applause on the reactions button, or however you prefer to do it. So I think I'll hand back over to Barbara to wrap up and tell us what comes along next in the day.
Thank you very much, Mike, for